It was dawn on June 25, 1950, when the first shells shattered the fragile peace of the Korean Peninsula. North Korean troops under the command of Kim Il-sung surged across the 38th parallel in a surprise attack, launching a conflict that would leave millions dead, cities in ashes, and families torn apart for generations. The Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, was anything but forgettable for those who lived through its brutality. It became a test of wills between the capitalist West and the communist East, dragging the United States, China, and the Soviet Union into a bloody and unresolved standoff that still haunts the world today. But how did this small strip of land in East Asia become the crucible for one of the most destructive wars of the 20th century? The roots of division, from allies to enemies. To understand the Korean War, we must first look at the final days of World War II. Korea had been under brutal Japanese occupation since 1910. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Allies agreed, almost as an afterthought, to divide Korea temporarily. The Soviet Union would accept the surrender of Japanese forces north of the 38th parallel. The United States would do the same in the south. What was meant to be a stopgap measure hardened into a permanent division as Cold War tensions escalated. In the north, the Soviets backed Kim Il-sung, a communist fighter who had spent years in exile. In the south, the Americans supported Syngman Rhee, a staunch anti-communist who had lived in the U.S. for decades. Both men dreamed of a unified Korea, but under their own rule. As Washington and Moscow turned from uneasy allies to bitter rivals, Korea became one of the earliest victims of Cold War geopolitics. The spark, invasion across the 38th parallel. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 25, 1950, North Korea's military, well equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, launched a massive assault on the south. Kim Il-sung believed victory would be swift. His army overwhelmed South Korean forces, capturing Seoul within just 3 days. Civilians fled in terror, streaming southward in endless columns as the North forces advanced. The United States and its allies reacted with shock. President Harry Truman framed the invasion as a test of the free world's resolve. If the U.S. failed to act, would communism spread unchecked to other parts of Asia? The United Nations, led by American power, passed a resolution calling for member states to repel the aggression. Soon, a multinational force, though overwhelmingly American, was pouring into Korea under the UN flag. A war of swings, from defeat to victory and back again. The early months were disastrous for the South and its allies. Pushed back to the southeastern tip of the peninsula, the UN forces clung desperately to a defensive perimeter around the port city of Pusan. But General Douglas MacArthur, the charismatic and controversial U.S. commander, had a daring plan, a surprise amphibious landing far behind enemy lines at Incheon. In September 1950, the plan worked spectacularly. UN forces stormed ashore at Incheon, cutting North Korean supply lines and forcing a hasty retreat. Seoul was recaptured, and soon the UN armies were pushing deep into North Korea. Many believed victory was near. MacArthur spoke of reuniting Korea, even of advancing into China. But that overconfidence would soon exact a terrible price. China enters the fray. The tide turns again. As UN forces approached the Yalu River, the border with China, Beijing grew alarmed. For Mao Zedong, the idea of American troops on China's doorstep was intolerable. In October 1950, waves of Chinese volunteer troops secretly crossed into North Korea. They struck with devastating force, driving the UN forces into a panicked retreat. The winter of 1950 to 51 was a nightmare. Soldiers froze in the bitter cold as they fought desperate rearguard actions. Seoul fell again, and once more refugees filled the roads, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. The war became a bloody stalemate. Front lines seesawed back and forth until they settled roughly where they had started, near the 38th parallel. For 2 more years, soldiers and civilians alike endured brutal trench warfare, artillery bombardments, and relentless air attacks. The human cost, a nation in ruins. The toll of the Korean War was staggering. Estimates vary, but roughly 3 million people, soldiers and civilians, died in just 3 years. Cities like Seoul, Pyongyang, and countless smaller towns were reduced to rubble. Entire villages were wiped from the map. Millions more were wounded, orphaned, or left homeless. On both sides, atrocities occurred. Massacres of prisoners, civilian slaughter, and scorched earth tactics left scars that have not healed. The Korean people paid the heaviest price for a war that was, in many ways, not of their own making. The armistice, a war without end. By mid-1951, both sides realized that total victory was out of reach. Yet negotiations dragged on for 2 more years, bogged down by disputes over issues like the return of prisoners of war. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. But here's the crucial point. No peace treaty followed. The war was halted but not officially ended. A demilitarized zone, DMZ, 2.5 miles wide and 160 miles long, was created, one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. To this day, North and South Korea remain technically at war, their guns quiet but ready. The legacy: a divided land, a divided world. The Korean War reshaped the global order. It cemented the Cold War divide, intensified the US-China rivalry, and ensured that the Korean Peninsula would remain one of the most dangerous flashpoints on the planet. For North Korea, the war became a foundational myth, proof, in the regime's eyes, of the country's heroic defiance against imperialists. For the South, it was a tragedy that led eventually to economic miracle, but left deep political and emotional scars. And for the world, the Korean War showed just how easily a regional conflict could escalate into a global disaster. The use of atomic weapons was seriously considered. The possibility of World War III was terrifyingly real. Today, the DMZ remains a stark reminder of the war's unfinished business. The North, under Kim Jong-un, clings to its nuclear weapons. The South, a modern democracy and economic powerhouse, lives under constant threat. And families, divided for generations, still dream of reunion. The forgotten war remembered. Why is the Korean War often overshadowed by World War II or the Vietnam War? Perhaps because it ended in stalemate rather than victory. Perhaps because its horrors were so swiftly buried beneath Cold War propaganda. But make no mistake, the Korean War shaped the modern world in profound ways. As we look at the tense peace that still grips the Korean Peninsula, the lessons of that brutal conflict are more relevant than ever. The price of miscalculation, the human cost of ideological extremism, and the danger of great power rivalries. These are not just history, they are the warnings of the Korean War, echoes from a past that still shapes our future.